I would first like to invoke the blessings of Her Holiness Shri Sathguru Ma and my pranam to Swami Shri Hari Prasad Ji. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Swamiji for calling me up and asking me to present my views in this August forum. My thanks also goes to the organizers and the members of Shri Vishnu Mohan Foundation Trust. My paper is entitled Right Education and Sustainable Development, Learning to Unlearn. And I was just listening to the presentations given by Mr. Ishan Menon and after that Sir Pankaj Jain. And I feel it is so very, very crucial to now learn how to unlearn certain things that we have, carried for all these years. And that's where I would focus on. Now, obviously, when we talk about right education, we first of all need to make a distinction between what right education is and what right to education is. And we heard Mr. Benin talking about a lot of unpleasant things which he felt should be pointed out when we talk about pandemic, and we all have been sufferers in this. So I would first of all start by distinguishing these two concepts, right processes of education and right to education. We stand at a juncture wherein education as a right process and the fundamental right to education must necessarily be considered not separately or even as mutually consequent aspects of society, but as ideals deeply enmeshed in the very fabric of the intellectual and moral lenses through which a society may evaluate itself in all the contexts that it offers to its members. Let us consider first the latter, that is right to education. Now, what do we understand by a right? A fundamental right, if I take the definition, is an ideologically legitimate, legally binding claim that every individual deserves to uphold, simply as a consequence of their basic humanity. Undoubtedly, then, every human being ought to enjoy right to education. But even a cursory discerning look at the not so privileged third world nations would reveal that there exists a huge gap in access to education as per global standards. The dropout rate is alarmingly high, especially among girls, and the raging pandemic has only added to the woe. Yesterday, we were listening to Ma'am Shrikala Nayar's presentation, where she talks about how important it is to bring women to the fold of education and how badly they are losing out. I would also like to draw attention to a few everyday situations which I witnessed during this pandemic, and I'm sure even you all have to a great extent. In fact, I was listening to Mr. Menon when he points out that how students have been, described as the lost generation now. Okay, we need to take up these crucial issues. Where do these children stand? Okay, I would talk about a little girl. I call her Rim, and little Rim is all of 7 years old, and already one can notice her going through her books in a very disinterested, nonchalant manner. Writ clear as day on her face is her boredom, a dispassion that arises out of reading the same old thing over and over again for more than a year. Her mother, a single parent, cannot possibly afford the currently indispensable so-called smart Android phone. And thus, in the era wherein the pandemic has largely forced the mode of instruction online, Rim has been left behind. And this story is, of course, not Rim's alone. It is not uncommon knowledge that there are many children who have automatically found themselves on the wrong side of a digital reality. I'm sorry to say this, with the pandemic and its continued onslaught. A first year undergraduate student quite hesitantly tells me that they have only one mobile handset at home, which her brother uses for his studies. She is left with no option but to miss classes. When it is a choice between survival and education, obviously education needs to wait. And she asks me, What can I do, ma'am? Tell me what to do. And I honestly have no answer to that. This paper intends to look at this disturbing reality and explore a few questions. We have no answers, but at least we can raise a few questions regarding how do we gear up for the challenges of sustainable holistic education in the post-pandemic world. I don't know whether we will ever reach the post-pandemic world or not, but we can hope and pray and prepare ourselves for a better world in the post-pandemic phase. If we look at the United Nations proposed goals for sustainable development, we see the emphasis on ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promotion of lifelong learning opportunities for all. And I really want to focus on this idea of lifelong learning opportunities, which I think is not happening. It is needless to say that the pandemic has pushed us backwards and derailed us from the track of working towards this much needed goal. The big question here is whether opening of classroom doors once again ensure education for all, or the need of the hour is to review the manner in which we impart education and how it needs to change. You know what? That is why I focus on why it's about time we learn how to unlearn certain things which we have picked up over the years, over generations rather. Considering now the former, that is right education, it is clear that the paradigms of understanding which constitute, what constitutes proper or right educational process is very difficult to say and needs a recontextualization of some sort. Before doing so, let us first of all ask ourselves what education stands for and what it ought to achieve. What is education? Education, there is no doubt about the fact, ought to bring out the very best in us. But the conditions in which that best self finds expression is perhaps a far more complicated process than, involving many factors. And then we can really imagine it's not a very easy process at all. Three main factors that invariably determine what we learn are our ability to learn, number one. Number two, environment of learning. And number three, ideals aspired for in learning. Okay, I would take these three factors one by one. These three factors largely determine the trajectories that education might take, provided one realizes that education is a complex process, as I've already mentioned, involving a very delicate relationship between the educator, who's supposed to teach, and the educand, who is to be taught, or who is learning here. If education begins on a premise that the pupil knows nothing, and I have seen it myself in my experiences as a student also, that most of the teachers have this feeling that children don't know anything. I think we should unlearn this preconceived notion. So if education begins on a premise that pupils know nothing, he needs to be taught, given instructions, and eventually tested on how much of the instructions given has been successfully retained, then sadly enough, one can safely conclude no education happens at all. And it's a very sad state of affair. Pedagogy, as we understand pedagogy, cannot be a mode of delivery system where the instruction ensures that a child is taught to retain most of what is handed down to him or thrusted upon. I particularly stress on the word thrusted upon. I am reminded of Mr. Thomas Gradgrind and his timid, jittery pupils in Charles Dickens's Hard Times. Now, the question that naturally comes up to my mind is, have we been able to draw ourselves away from the typically dark picture that people like Gradgrind represent? A rigid and repressive system of education? Or are we in a much more deeper crisis? Given the fact that with a deluge of information at our access on a click of a button, we are truly at a loss as to how one can be guided to sift, to sift the relevant facts from the irrelevant ones, and eventually turn the facts received to interpretive knowledge or transformative knowledge, if I may add the word. The question that subsequently follows here is whether the educator is able to play the role of a guide or a facilitator in the process of learning, or is he at a loss as to how he could engage in building up a meaningful relationship with his pupil. There is no denying the fact that nowadays that significant connect, okay, between an educator and his pupil seems to be missing. I mean, as a teacher, I can vouch for that. There have been occasions where I feel that we cannot really connect to our students, resulting in students who learn facts. In fact, if we look at the grades, I don't think so we ever, could get those grades which students nowadays are getting. So they do learn facts, but fail to grasp the knowledge skills involved therein. Consequently, pupils fail to apply what is learned in a real, aggressively competitive world. He not only loses his faith in education per se, but also suffers from a complete disillusionment as what his capabilities are. I was just listening to Mr. Menon, and I was agreeing with what he was saying. The youth today are really very, very sad, and we need to do something about this. So they are completely, they suffer from a complete disillusionment as to what their capabilities are. The eventual outcome is lack of self-esteem, violent, disruptive behavior, which we can see worldwide, and a disturbingly negative attitude, which is very, very worrisome, towards self, others, and life at large. The sordid picture drawn is quite a familiar fact cutting across the globe. We can, hear and see the dreadful things that young generation is involved in. Okay, so what we find that this picture is very, very true for the entire globe. And this is turning education into a contesting site, okay, open to rapid challenges. Youth in general, and especially the ones who have had a difficult and troubled life, seem to have been caught up in, severe, tedious periods of frustration with no sense of direction at all. Hard times, perhaps, are even harder now. We are in what may be called a moral aporia. I am reminded of Zygmunt Bauman, who in his book Postmodern Ethics talks a lot about what moral aporia is and how we human beings are all caught up in this moral aporia. Perhaps there's no way out. And when I bring that to the scenario of education, I would say no one seems to have an agreement as to what would be the right way of teaching learning process. In fact, when I was asked to present my views on this topic, right education and sustainable development, I was more worried about this word right. What does right actually stand for? I don't know. The more a teacher tries to impress upon the pupils the need for discipline and obedience, the more the students have the tendency to break free and defy any form of instructions, resulting in an uncomfortable tussle, often leading to dismal learning outcomes, and drives both the teacher and the student towards a situation which is no less than a moral conundrum. Now the question is, how can this situation ever change? Can we find a way out of this? Definitely, such a predicament calls for a review of the manner in which we perceive the teaching learning process. If the educator's role is to reach out to the learners and ignite interest in them to get involved in the process of learning, then the educator needs to work along with each one of them, which perhaps is not happening. Teaching learning process can no longer remain a mere handing down of a set of instruction manuals. There has to be mutual perception, a mutual participation, a perception of what the students want, that is interaction. The learner cannot be pushed out of bounds for lack of amenities. Now, technology is a much needed tool to enhance learning, undoubtedly, and the pandemic has taught that to all of us so well. Okay, we can't do without technology now. And obviously, we are all reaping the benefits of technology. But what I want to focus on is that as we move towards this technologically driven education system, we can see how technology is becoming the power that dictates. I'm reminded of Michel Foucault, power that dictates who can afford to avail the benefits of education and who fails to catch up. So if I can buy the technology, I'm there. And if I can't afford that, then I naturally come out of the system. This digital divide is real and we must accept it and here to stay unless we change our ways of perceiving how education can transform the lives of the less privileged learners. And I think it is very, very important to focus on those people who cannot even voice their problems because they're out of the visibility area. We don't usually see them. As Thomas Gunn, an Anglo-American poet, said in his poem entitled Lebensraum, I just read out his lines. It's very, very touching and I think forces us to think. Life should be a human undertaking. I know I undertook it, yet have found that in my every move, I prevent someone from stepping where I step. And this is what is happening with those underprivileged, hapless learner. We are stepping where they could have stepped. And unless we work on that, sustainable development perhaps is not possible. Mere opening of the doors of the classroom to the disadvantaged learners who could not avail the technology-driven online mode of instruction perhaps is not enough. The greater challenge lies in retaining them in the classroom. This calls for a change in the manner education is perceived. If education needs to be effective, it cannot be seen as, I already mentioned, a delivery system tied to a time-bound curriculum. I here again bring the concept of lifelong opportunities as suggested in the SDG goals. Can a time-bound curriculum help us to attain that? We need to think about that. On the contrary, I would suggest that a flexible system might work better for students who often fail to keep pace and find themselves caught between the demands of formal education system and drudgery of survival. We cannot ignore the drudgery of survival, at least not after what we have gone through recently. Perhaps, I'm saying perhaps, a way out of this quagmire is to renew the bond of teacher-pupil. An educator should be more of a forerunner who leads by example and not as an instructor who demands observance of rules but remains alienated and distanced from the actual situation in which the young students find themselves. Instead of expecting the students to take a step forward, always to reach out to the teachers, the reverse situation might work better, where teachers go out of their way to reach out where their help as facilitators may be needed. I was just reading about a particular teacher in a village who actually started a school in the village courtyard during pandemic. I think we should be teachers like him, who have gone out of their way to reach out to the students who became invisible. That's where the change should come. So we need to reach out to those students where we can help them as facilitators. If the young pupils are assured that they need not fear their teacher, they would immediately be more receptive to the educator's ideas and values. Love not only replaces fear with trust, but removes the barriers which often unconsciously inhibit learning. So it is extremely important, I feel, to look at the emotional intelligence of the students. Unless we do that, we will not be able to reach out to them. However, what one needs to keep in mind and be wary of is that making the pupils pliable enough, which often we teachers do, so that they blindly accept what the educator has to convey, should never be the educator's concern under any circumstances. Rather, the educator's ethical responsibility lies in realizing that each pupil is unique in his own difference. I was listening to Professor Paneerselvam yesterday, and he brought in the idea of Emmanuel Levinas. And I go to Emmanuel Levinas for consolation when he says that we need to recognize the alterity of the other. And here, the other obviously is the student. The other's being cannot be reduced to a timid, obedient, and vulnerable object that can be easily smothered or destroyed at will, or if need be, molded either with force or punishment. And punishment, I tell you, need not always be physical. We also need to take care that we avoid hurting children where it hurts, that is the mind. So we need to, mold them in a way that they, don't feel scared, and that should not inhibit learning. Now, and they also should not be scared of the powerful rhetoric and formidable presence of the teacher. In most cases, it happens. Students become so scared of the teacher, that after that, no learning takes place. The educator's foremost responsibility lies in recognizing that the learning experience is not a linear process, where only the pupils learn from the educator, but the educator needs to learn in turn from the pupil about what he wants and expects from him or her. Hence, every pupil must be given the opportunity to express himself whenever he wishes to do so. The merit of a successful educator lies in practicing what may be called the art of listening and interpreting both the language of words and, more importantly, the silences of the significant other. Such a rapport perhaps would, make the learning environment a happy place, which a student would never want to abandon. Finally, if what is aspired for in learning is sustainable development, then it's about time we focus on learning that will eventually stay with us in future. Otherwise, there's no point talking about sustainable development. Education must be viewed as a process of lifelong learning opportunities and not a product that reaches its date of expiration and hence rendered useless, ready to be discarded and replaced by market's latest products. So long learning outcomes are judged in terms of arbitrary grades and selective emphasis on disciplines that are determined by market-driven forces as job creators, true learning can never take place. And nowadays, we find that students have to achieve all 100% in order to get admission in good institutions. Isn't that a scary scene? If we follow the motto that what sells remains, education becomes a commodity with economic value, and educators mere service providers with a target to consume to attract consumers. Both eventually stands defeated against the aggressively competitive market-driven forces. We need to realize that true education cannot be judged by monetary gain alone, but learning of skills, values, and rekindling the interest of creating meaningful experiences in life, that is what is required. The world definitely also needs better thinkers, artists, artisans, caregivers, nature healers, farmers, gardeners, teachers, and not just experts in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's not that I'm against these disciplines, but let's not make any discipline dominant. Okay, let's not snatch the space of other disciplines. That is something we need to keep in mind. Perhaps this is what Mahatma Gandhi also wanted for our country when he talked about basic education policy. I'm really hopeful that the national education policy, with its emphasis on interdisciplinarity, might pave a way forward in this regard. And the mandatory instruction-based approach should give way to a care-based, do-it-yourself approach if education is expected to transform the lives of already battered young learners. Now, learning that makes us better human beings and teach us how to make this world a better place is what we need if we intend to achieve equitable education as a sustainable development goal by 2030 at least. Let's look forward to working towards a better society. Education can prove to be a meaningful process when it enables the learner to realize that to live in a fast changing social space, pluralistic to the core, let's accept it, one cannot avert from making choices from the innumerable possibilities open to all. But the real task lies in learning to be responsible for the choices made with a firm belief that the presence of mutuality and reciprocity of love, trust, and respect depends on the choices made. So it's very, very crucial to make the right kind of choices. An educator can, to the best of his ability, try and attempt to create an environment whereby the learners are encouraged to ponder on the choices made, like self-reflective beings. One is reminded of Socrates here, who would have us believe that no one can be taught, but can only be made to think. I sometimes feel that we have lost that spirit to make our children think. If education is derived from the Latin word educare, as we understand, then ideally it ought to be a process focused on bringing about a sense of we feeling, mark the word care, among people, resulting in holistic well-being of the entire society. It is needless to reiterate that human society should be viewed as a family, where satisfaction lies in negating one's own interest for the well-being of the other. It is perhaps in a tentative working towards a better society that the future of inclusive education lay in. I wish to finally draw inspiration from the timeless wisdom of Swami Vivekananda when he says, education is not the amount of information that is put into your brain and runs riot there undigested all your life. We must have life building, man making, character making assimilation of ideas. I don't know how far we have achieved that. Swamiji goes on to write, to me, the very essence of education is concentration of mind, not collecting of facts. If I had to do my education over again and had any voice in that matter, I would not study facts at all, he says. I would develop the power of concentration and detachment, and then with a perfect instrument, I could collect facts at will. And I emphasize on this word of Swamiji, let's learn to collect facts at will. We need to make the right kind of choices. Perhaps any meaningful attempt towards sustainable development must focus on education that work towards enabling learners to explore the hitherto untapped powers of their own minds. I wish to suggest that we should all take refuge to the ancient Ashtanga Yoga to redirect us to our Swadharma. Perhaps we have forgotten that. Thank you.